Thank you so much for being here. This is the second virtual roundtable in a series that the library has put together on the New York NYC Racial Justice Commission. Just to introduce myself, I'm Natalia Sucre, research and writing librarian at MCNY. And the way what we're going to be doing today is we'll hear from our guests, Elise Goldin and Alikah Browne, on an activist proposal to bring justice to the housing crisis in New York City. We'll hear the basics of it, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. And hopefully this will be a conversation. Okay, and I wanted to give a little context for this talk. In the summer, we did a talk on local politics, and we were very impressed with the focus, with the participation, from the quality of participation from students, if not always the quantity. And there seemed to be a real eagerness for a forum to discuss political, civic concerns around racial equity. So for the fall, we thought it would be good to focus on a political process that is unfolding now. And our first talk gave a very general overview of the commission's work. And today we're going to hear sort of from the other side of the political process through Elise Goldin and Alikah Browne, who are both from the New Economy Project, which is a group working with a larger alliance, the New York NYC Community Land Initiative. So I will let our guest speakers introduce themselves, and we can get started.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. Yeah, maybe we can kind of briefly introduce ourselves, and then we would also love to hear who else is in this space. But my name is Elise, and I'm an organizer around community land trusts with the New Economy Project. And I can talk a little bit more about how I got to this position, but maybe first, Alikah, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Alikah. I am a legal fellow at New Economy Project. I was brought on to provide legal and policy assistance to community land trusts across the city. Yeah, pass it back to Elise.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, maybe first we can kind of go around and just say, yeah, if people want to introduce themselves and say, yeah, names, pronouns, which I guess we both forgot to do. I would use she or they pronouns. Alikah, do you want to share? Okay, yeah. Cool.
I use she, her pronouns, and I put it into my name in my little Zoom box.
Cool. So yeah, if people want to share names, pronouns, and then something maybe like where you live, maybe what borough, and then what you like about where you live or your borough. You can pass it to Natalia to kick us off.
Oh, yeah. I'm Natalia. My pronouns are she, her. I live in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and I love how much people love green spaces around here. And I will pass it to Ren.
Hi, I'm Ren. Pronouns are he, him. Very excited about this talk. I live in Brooklyn. I live in Kensington. Natalia and I have run into each other at a point or two in the past. And what I love most, I would say green space too, but I really love the park, which is green space. So same on that. Thanks. Oh, and I will pass it to Kate.
Kate. I prefer they pronouns, though not usually at work. And I live in Jackson Heights in Queens, which is an incredibly diverse, ethnically, linguistically, culturally neighborhood. And one thing that I particularly love about it is we've had a really robust open streets initiative, and it's created a tremendous amount of community. And just warning, in about 45 minutes, I'm going to officially adopt my child with Queens County Municipal Family Court. And so she's about to come up, and so I'm going to be kind of in and out of this virtual space in anticipation of that.
Congrats. Yeah, does someone else, maybe Tina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tina. I'm the evening reference librarian at the college. What was the other question? Because was it a two-part or just who am I?
Yeah, welcome. So if you want to just share your pronouns and maybe where you live or what borough you live in and what you love about where you live.
Oh, okay. I live in Crown Heights, which is in Brooklyn, and I love Brooklyn. Not specific to a neighborhood. I have issues with Crown Heights right now because the people here don't want to wear masks, so, But outside of that, I love my neighborhood because I'm 2 blocks away from Eastern Parkway, so I can walk the entire parkway and the greenery. I know I basically in my neighborhood, when I do my walking, I know where all the shaded streets are in Crown Heights and in Bed-Stuy. So I follow trees.
That's so nice. Thank you. Yeah, Pamela or Karen?
Yeah, go. Well, I live in, my pronouns are she, her, and I live also in Kensington. So it's interesting to find people that you've been working with for years live in your same neighborhood and you never knew it. But anyway, and what I love about the neighborhood is the diversity of different places you can go within walking distance that have completely different feelings. So you can be in the Caribbean neighborhood, you can be in the green trees of Ditmas Park, you can be in the very heavily, Bangladesh kind of Asian communities. So that's what I love the best about it.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for sharing. And so again, I'm Elise. I also live in Flatbush. And I also love so many things that you all have mentioned. Also the park. It's so great to live near Prospect Park, especially as the season's changing. Yeah, so just briefly before we get into our presentation, just to give a little bit of context about who I am. I'm from Chicago. I moved to New York, I think like 11 years ago, and have been community organizer during that time, mostly doing tenant organizing. And so as a tenant organizer, really seeing the ways that, landlords are using so many different loopholes to push people out of apartments where they've lived for generations, and really also seeing the power of like people coming together and fighting to change laws and to support each other. And so that work has kind of led me to this work that we'll go into around like taking land out of speculation and like helping to really empower people to have a voice in what's happening in their community. So yeah, that's like a very big overview of me, or a brief overview. But I will pass it to Alikah and then we'll start the presentation.
Thanks, Elise. Yeah, so I am originally from Brooklyn, from Brownsville, moved to Bed-Stuy, and I'm in the South Bronx. I love that. So my family's from Trinidad. I love the fact that sometimes I feel like I'm in Trinidad when I'm in certain parts of New York City, and there's not many places like that around the country, maybe Miami, but that's about it. And so I love the diversity of New York City. And how I got here, so I am a lawyer, but I went to law school for the purpose of dealing with the housing injustice that I've lived through, that I've seen, that I've studied. I felt it as a kid, studied it in college, and realized that the housing injustices that I felt are really they've been a long time coming as a result of racial discrimination, segregation, racial disinvestment, all of that. And I wanted to go to law school to address that, but kind of on the defensive side, I thought that my place was in housing court to defend tenants that were being evicted or trying to actually get better repairs to their homes. But when, at least for me personally, when the situation hit home and my own father was evicted because he was actually, our building came out of rent stabilization because a lot of the loopholes that Elise mentioned, I started asking lawyers, like, what could have been done here to not just stop him from being evicted, but my entire block, essentially. That was like in Fort Greene when we were living there. And they said, first, the block could have been better organized, right? And actually been trying to get ahead of the situation rather than constantly being like divided and conquered and having to fight these individual battles. And so I started thinking about the power of community, the power to organize, and to like just envision something better from the outset and what it would look like if, rather than accepting the conditions that are thrown on us, if we created those conditions. And that's how I came to what we'll discuss as the community land trust model, and ways to just, be able to support that a little bit more, as a way of kind of not always having to be on the defensive. So that's how I'm here. And we're an economic justice organization, New Economy Project is, and we help to convene and organize different campaigns, one of them being the New York City Community Land Initiative. So I'm gonna actually share my screen to get us started. Let's see. And people have to let me know if they see the screen. Okay.
Yeah, we see it.
Yes.
We got it.
Perfect.
Cool. So we're gonna kick it off with this presentation and give sort of an overview of the work that we're doing. But also, especially since there's so few people here, like feel free to type in the chat any questions or shout out any comments or whatever. Like this should be, feel free to like participate as we go. So as Alikah said, one of the areas of work that we focus on in New Economy Project is this coalition called NYCLI, the New York City Land Initiative. And this is a coalition that that really grew out of the work of a group called Picture the Homeless, which is a group of people who have experienced homelessness, that are working to like deal with the root causes of homelessness and try to change the ways that like homelessness is viewed and land policies are hurting people, right, and perpetuating homelessness. And so through a campaign that they were doing, they began to survey vacant land and through this survey process realized that that there was like enough vacant land and housing to house almost 20,000 people in the city, which was at that time about 4 times the population of the city's shelter system. And through that process and that realization, they started to explore like what are the root causes of homelessness? Why is land being kept vacant? And sort of came to this tool that they started to, really dig into and think about, called a community land trust, which we're going to go into a little bit in a few minutes. So NYCLI is an organization that formed around like promoting community land trusts in the city of New York. And yeah, so kind of through that work. Okay, sorry. So NYCLI is really a place of collaboration, learning, policy advocacy, mutual support around groups that are really organizing on the ground to be community land trusts, as well as other advocates. And the goals are to address root causes of homelessness, to show that land and like promote the idea that land is a common good and that housing is a human right. That housing and economic development should be for people, not for profit. Planning and land use decisions should be made by communities who are most impacted by homelessness, displacement, and environmental justice. And that land, water, air, and other natural resources must be stewarded and protected. So the group of organizations really came together to promote community land trusts, but like through this lens and through these values. So now we're going to talk a little bit, just kind of define what is a community land trust. So a community land trust are essentially community-controlled nonprofits that own land and make sure that land is used to provide permanently affordable housing or other community needs. So a community land trust could hold things like retail spaces or community gardens or farming spaces or community centers, really whatever a community envisions is needed in that space. And a really important component of a community land trust is that the land and the buildings or the uses on top of the land are separate. So the CLT, as you can see in the picture, the CLT owns the land and works to make sure that land is benefiting the community, while the buildings or the whatever is on top of the land is leased to either individuals or organizations. And the CLT structure issues a 99-year lease generally that makes sure that those uses are always affordable. Like maybe there might be income restrictions, for example, placed on a building. And then the CLT, which is owning the actual land, is governed then by the community and promoting meaningful community decision-making over the development, and also ideally doing ongoing organizing and making sure that whatever the land is being used for is really benefiting. So that you can see there are three main components listed out: separate ownership of land and buildings, permanent affordability, and democratic community governance. And just a note, just to go back really quick, the structure of the board is generally like three different parts. One is people who are either who are living and working on the land right now, people who are using the land. And the second part is members of the surrounding community who are making sure that the land is not just being used for the current users, but also a real public benefit. And then the third is kind of larger public stakeholders like advocates or technical assistance providers who are going to help kind of stabilize that work. All right. Yeah, so this has been a growing movement in New York City. As of a few years ago, there was really just one functioning CLT called Cooper Square CLT, which was stewarding over 300 units of deeply affordable housing in the Lower East Side. But in the past couple of years, due to organizing that NYCLI has been doing, the work of Picture the Homeless, as well as the real condition, excuse me, the real conditions on the ground of speculation and displacement that has just been spiraling, right? Groups have been coming together and organizing CLTs, and now there are over 15 CLTs from Brownsville to the Northwest Bronx. People are really working to not just be kind of what we were describing before in our intros, or what Alikah was saying, like just being on the defensive and organizing defensively against gentrification, or representing tenants. Like, how are we actually taking the land back and taking it out of speculation, and making sure that spaces are really used for the benefit before a real fight needs to come in. So yeah, and so just a note that one thing that has been really, really challenging, as you can imagine, in New York City is actually acquiring land, right? We know that land is really, really expensive here. And of course, that makes it really hard to not just organize, but then to actually get land into the control of the people. So I'll pass it to Alikah to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. So that was just a very quick overview about what a community land trust is and why groups are using it. And also how they're just trying to essentially decommodify land, stop land from being treated as a commodity that's always sold to the highest bidder, and instead bringing that land into public use to stabilize communities, right? Like, there's one of the original community land trusts in the country, New Communities in Georgia, their organizers said land is power. Power comes from the land, and communities have been destabilized, and their power and community power has been taken away from them through lack of control over that land. And so that's really part of the basis from which NYCLI has been formed. But if anybody has questions, actually, we'll just take a pause. Does anyone have questions about a community land trust, or why there's a growing movement in New York City, before we essentially power through?
I don't have a question, just a statement. I
Yeah.
sent it to Kate as a private message a minute ago. I lived on State Street, downtown Brooklyn, right behind Macy's, for 30 plus years.
Mhm.
And so what downtown Brooklyn looks like now.
Mhm.
And it was interesting to me how it changed, because the initial plan was for office space after they did Metro Tech
Mhm.
with Chase Manhattan and Beers and Stern. It was supposed to become that whole tech. Fire department was supposed to have their space was going to move in that whole area. And for me personally, it seemed like once 9/11 it was a 20-year plan, this whole what they were going to do to downtown Brooklyn. If you were aware, you knew that this is where the movement was going toward office space in downtown Brooklyn, because of all that transportation hub that was there. And then 9/11 happened. And then the need became for a quick way to access home if you didn't want to live in Manhattan, if you didn't want to live in Manhattan anymore because of 9/11. And then the speculation, and then all that office space then became condos and mostly condos and high rent areas.
Mhm.
Brooklyn Bridge Park was always going to be what it was going to be. Had always been a fight about what they were going to make that area.
Mhm.
So all of that to say that watching it all change, my landlord, Pine Management, who's known in the city for how they displaced all their people in all their different buildings all throughout the city, and how they did it in terms of harassing us and lowballing us in terms of what they would pay for us to move out, because my building was right there behind all the train stations and everything. And when you go there now and you see what happened, and knowing that used to be all parking lots.
Mm.
And when the the request for proposals went out, you found out that all that property was actually owned by the government. the federal government owned that property, and they put that out there. And then how they created just one building on Skimmerhorn Street that was supposed to be like an Actors Equity building that then morphed into a building that became where Brooklyn Dance is now on the first floor, and everybody else that lives in the building is people with mental illness issues. So they have stuff for them, support system for them within that building, and that's the only building that is really affordable. And then when you see what's affordable now based on the AMI, because the income has changed, and all the people that used to live there cannot afford to live there. They can't even afford to go into the grocery stores that are there now, because it was a food desert. We did not have any grocery stores. And when they did build one, it was Brooklyn Fare, which is overpriced, with the overpriced restaurant, the Michelin star restaurant in it, so it's, and because that neighborhood was not a real community neighborhood, in that you didn't have a lot of residents living there, they did not know what was going on to go to those community board meetings to see what was happening. It just swept up and came and happened.
Thank you for sharing that. You hit on so many different topics that will actually transition us into this proposal, but I just want to pull out a few things that you mentioned, right? So first, the reality that decisions are being made, right? None of this is happening by accident, right? Decisions are being made. There's government-owned land, and decisions are being made about what to do with that. And then when decisions are being made to use that land for profit, other actors react, right? So you mentioned your landlord, then started looking at that as an opportunity, right? So there's an opportunity for what was once housing that was once affordable, because that's what the neighborhood was right for. Now suddenly landlords are saying, I see a lot of development happening. There's a chance here to raise rents, right? And that's speculation. So there's like hyper speculation that forms from that. And then there's like somewhat of a disempowering of the people there. So you're talking about downtown Brooklyn. It wasn't residential, but you had Fort Greene projects not too far with a lot of people, right? But the question is, how were they being mobilized or even empowered to weigh in? And even if they were able to weigh in, how much would their voice have made a difference, right? So there's a few things there. And then what comes out of that is lack of access and lack of affordability, right? You have grocery stores. So you have grocery stores that may have been beneficial, but out of reach for the people who are living there. So then that creates a situation where people are forced to move out, and others can come in and afford that. So there's a few different things, but really it gets to the heart of, it makes you think, all right, what are the root causes? And there's a few root causes. The fact that land is being treated as a commodity and not as shelter, not as stability. And also the lack of planning around real community benefit and planning around profit instead. And that's something that the community land trust model is trying to get ahead of. But also that's something that nicely our coalition is thinking through, like, what are the policies that can change that dynamic, right? It's a real paradigm that preferences market-driven approaches, for-profit approaches, and we know that there's a need to shift that paradigm. So I'm gonna go into the next slide to talk about public land, which you touched on, Tina, like in city-owned land. So right now, the city, so the different entities own land. The city owns land, the state owns land, the federal government owns land. But what we're talking about specifically is the land that the city owns. They look at that land as their real estate, and they're making choices about what it does with that land and what it does with those buildings. And so before we kind of go into this map that we're showing here that shows the city-owned land in New York City's public land, can anyone think of an example that they recently heard of where the city owns land or controls land or a building and plan to give it away without benefiting the local community?
There's parcels in every borough. It's like, pick a borough.
Right.
And
So-
what comes to mind to me right now is Harlem, because Harlem was where they burnt down the landlords walked away and the city ended up owning it. And what they're building now on the city-owned property, and who they gave it, what developers they gave it to. The churches, if they weren't really mobilized, they can't even get to the land.
Anyone else?
I don't have a
Maybe I
good
could
example
say,
of
Um,
a way it's not necessarily benefiting the community, but when I was walking to school, I was thinking about, because I watched the mayor's debate, the night before, and I was just thinking about all of the issues around the jail situation and how the city is actually going to deal with that. So I just was thinking about the complexities of trying to place smaller jails in communities and how that's going to play itself out. So that may not be quite an example, but
No, that's related though.
Rikers Island, what are they going to do with it? How are they
Right.
going to
Right.
develop it?
That's right.
And I also just wanted to bring up in Flatbush, this is how I met you guys, Elise and Alikah, the Flatbush African Burial Ground, which is 29,000 square feet. It's a sizable piece of land, and the city is saying, but one of the things that they do is they say that it's going to be affordable housing, so that it is supposedly benefiting the community, but everyone
Affordable
knows
to who?
that space, that is not going to be affordable for anyone in the community now. And also just the fact that the whole issue of its being a flat African burial ground was really, the city knew that, but they didn't, no one in the community knew until very recently.
Right. So I'm gonna just that's all very, very helpful. Also, you all may remember the Amazon fight, right?
Yeah, in Long Island City.
Right. That was the parcels, the buildings that they were going to essentially give over to Amazon were city owned. And they were willing to give those buildings over with many government concessions and with almost no community input. Thankfully, lots and lots of groups organized around it and against it, but that was an example of where, the city has real estate. The city could be using that for to just the deepest needs of the community, and they make choices, right? And Amazon was only giving small concessions, like we're gonna offer jobs, right? But we know that was not enough to justify that kind of transfer.
Thinking about that one in particular, I live not so far from there, and it just reminds me of how existential these things feel in New York, right? For people of all incomes, because it really is it feels like a bodily threat, right? And it's a real high stakes kind of a game and has such huge cascading effects. So I think that's an important part about when we talk about land and zoning and all of these and access in New York. There's just it's such a high stakes thing for everybody.
Right.
This may be a tangent, but I'm just throwing it out here because it's on my mind as thinking about this issue. Is some of these, when you're looking on the internet, often they're showing these very innovative, housing pods that people are developing, these very tiny little new forms of housing that architects are coming up with that are, that are very, very inexpensive. You always look at those things thinking, why are people not, I understand the idea of going up because you can put more people, in a bigger development, but, it just seems as though doing things that are very, very, even subway spaces could actually be small little units that, you're kind of going into and you got a bed and at least you're not on the street sort of thing. So I'm just throwing out there, that's a total tangent, but, related to, I just didn't know whether there's any real innovative thinking about this challenge of homelessness.
Yeah. Innovative thinking, but also those that are informed by the people that are living in these neighborhoods, right? Like, or like the people who are in need of housing, what do they want to see, right? And how are the decisions that the city's making being informed by that conversation rather than in the existential way that we know it plays out. So yeah, I think these are all related. Can folks see the map that I have up? I'm just gonna give, so right now, I have this filtered a little bit, but the city owns more than 4,000 parcels of land. And as we just talked about, is actively making choices about who it transfers that land to. So real estate speculators might look at this map and see an opportunity, but for profit, right? They may say, as we talked about, that they'll provide jobs or commit to certain community benefits, but those tend to be empty promises just to get community buy-in or even tax exemptions or a cheaper price for the property. However, coalitions like ours, like NYCLI, looks at this and sees a real opportunity to ensure that public land is not lost to the private market and instead put to continuing public use. We know that no one is making more land available in New York City, which is why they're looking to build up. And so the city should not be getting rid of any land that it currently owns just for those short-term gains. I'm gonna just give a quick example. But also I know since the library's sponsoring this, there's one thing that I think about sometimes are the libraries that I see that are boarded up, right? And those are city owned and they've been, school buildings.
So these are all the vacant lands?
So right now, these are vacant or underutilized lots. And actually so there some of the blue dots are the libraries. The green dots are vacant lots or gardens, meaning that they have nothing on them. I don't have park space up because park space can't be developed anyway. Those have to be designated as park space. But I don't have NYCHA buildings up because those are occupied and those are also not city owned. So I have these filtered a bit.
But these are city owned or they're not, who are they owned by?
But different agencies of the city.
Oh, okay.
So when we say city owned, we're talking about it can be NYPD, it could be Department of Health, it could be Department of Education, it could be any of these agencies that control land for different purposes. And so I'll give an example, one that's particularly, so I said I live in the South Bronx and and if anyone wants to ever check out this website, it's nycommons.org. One of the legal services in our coalition maintains this, but I'll show you one example. It's a post office. It's near my house. I'm going to try to zoom in here. So So this is a post office that for as long as I've been living here, it's been sitting vacant, right? But we see that it's owned by Bronx Landmark LLC, which means that at some point it was given to a corporation, an LLC, for profit development. If it wasn't, it would have stayed in city ownership. You go to it, and I already know what's happening, but I'm just going through this exercise so you all see. You go to it and you see the picture, but you see the information that this post office was sold to a private owner in August 2014. So even though it was landmarked, and USPS instead signed a lease for the retail location. And I know that it was given to, what's his name? Who was running against Curtis Lewa on the Republican ticket, the mayoral ticket? Fernandez.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I can't
Anyway,
think of his name right now because there's so many people that were running at that time.
Yeah, he owns Zona de Cuba, which is an expensive restaurant on the rooftop of this post office, right? So here you have this big building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx that could have been used for a number of things. Big recreational center. I'm just giving examples. Affordable housing, daycare centers, but instead community centers, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure the community would have had a number of other good uses for it, as opposed to a restaurant that actually has red tape outside, not like red rope outside of it, because it's so-called exclusive. So just, just think, like, I think it's helpful to just think about those real world examples as we think about this proposal, but I've already gone on way too long. So I'm gonna go back.
So it's no longer city owned, actually?
No.
Right.
Bronx Landmark LLC. And it's not even fully developed yet. We don't, like, right now it's in a situation where it's landmarked. So they can't, like, there's certain architectural things that can't change, but
it's slowing them down to develop, to renovate it.
Right. But they can still put things that don't benefit the community into it. Right. So,
well, I mean, it's a little bit of a trade-off, because it is we're all kind of benefiting from this being a capitalist society. So, the fact that it's a sort of a philosophical discussion about, the degree of, you understand, public versus private.
And who that benefits in the process.
Right. And a balancing act, trying to manage all of this stuff and who's doing what with it. So I don't guess we want to have that conversation, but I'm just trying to say,
Yeah, but I think that's a part of it, right? Because we're talking about the South Bronx here, where there is literally a housing crisis, right? There's literally a health crisis, and
has always been.
Yeah,
right.
And
but
so
that is why you have things like community boards and that sort of thing, where there are processes of people, sort of getting involved and talking about what's happening in the community and weighing in on, what do we need and how should we get it? So,
right.
But
go ahead. Go ahead.
Where is New Economy Project, and how does that relate to all of this? Just that because you've been, I just am a little confused about all of this.
So we are an economic justice organization that is working to build newer systems, transform systems in a way that gives a new economy that works for all, right? Based off of racial justice, based off of social justice, ecological sustainability, and just systems of cooperation, right? Looking at what are the systems that have been hampering full participation in our economy, and full access and full benefit in our economy, and how can we transform those systems?
So you're like an organization located somewhere, or you're just like a project?
We're a New York City-based nonprofit organization.
Oh, where are you based?
In our office is in Manhattan, but we work citywide.
And I put their link in the chat, Pamela, if you want to take a look at it.
I mean, I didn't mean to go off into tangents. I was just trying to understand.
I would say, just to kind of respond to that, and we don't need to have a whole conversation, but it sort of leads into our next point, is like, we're not arguing, at least in this moment or this presentation, that there shouldn't be like businesses or stores or whatever coming into communities. And like, we're not saying that that should fully be restricted, but like when land is city owned, when land is so scarce and there's such a need for housing for these community benefits, and in the kind of context of the homelessness crisis, a health crisis, all of these things that we're talking about, when city owns the land and is getting rid of it, then it's such a waste, right? To be going to groups that are not going to be actually benefiting the community when that resource is so scarce.
Right. No, I understand.
And can I say, and because we have, because it's our new mayor, he's already talking about converting hotels.
Right.
Taking money from I don't know where, getting money from I don't know where to convert hotels into spaces for homeless people, which is, is going to smack up against, not in my backyard, like it did many, many years ago when they were housing families in hotels, et cetera, et cetera. And like you said, you have this land here that they probably have done backdoor deals with the developers already, but the ink hasn't dried on the paper. And so that's why now we can use all these empty hotels based on the fact that because of the pandemic, we got all these hotels that they built prior to the pandemic for tourism that are now closed.
But you don't think that's a good idea? I don't know. Are you saying that's not a good idea?
Why put all that money? First, you have to convert these rooms into spaces where people can live.
Right.
So first you have to get that money to do that. When you have parcels, that same kind of money, you can build on.
Yeah, I guess the only thing is that at
And
least
then
you've
you're
got an
talking about
existing structure.
where are these hotels at physically? You know, what neighborhoods are they in commercial areas? Because zoning was changed to build a lot of these hotels also. And where are they located?
Yeah, my only point is at least it's a creative, or, you know, it's a clear idea. And given the nature of the crisis, I, applaud him at least supporting something to try to move the city forward towards, because every scenario has challenges, that are going to need to be worked through. But, at least it's sort of a kind of a concrete plan. Does anybody know the number of homeless people actually that we're dealing with? Because I remember looking it up at some point.
Talking about homeless men, homeless families, homeless, emancipated minors, homeless people with mental issues,
Could we move on to the proposal?
Sorry.
Because I don't want to lose out on that.
Yeah.
Because it's a very specific proposal, and I think it brings together all of these issues that you guys are talking about now.
Sorry to take us off on tangents.
It's all good. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible, but if anything I say is unclear, please stop me. But, just kind of taking us from the point about there being public land available, city-owned land available, but it's dwindling and the city's making choices about who it transfers that land to and for what purpose. The reason why this is happening is because the city's allowed to do it, right? Right now, by law, the city has a lot of discretion in the way it transfers, sells, and leases its public land. And since the Giuliani administration in the 90s, the city has prioritized for-profit developers when disposing of public land for so-called affordable housing and other development. And actually in recent years, almost 75% of affordable housing projects that have been built on city-owned land, as well as city subsidy, have gone to for-profit developers, even though we know that they're less likely than nonprofits to develop permanently affordable housing and, as we mentioned, deeply affordable housing, that question of affordable for whom. Also, there's no accountable and transparent framework that the city's agencies are held to when disposing of public land. So, as you mentioned, some land sits in the Parks Department, some land sits in our housing agency, some land is under Department of Health control, regardless of if it's vacant or not. And these agencies can dictate their own processes of what it does with it. So there can be backdoor deals that are happening with Department of Health. There could be, departments that are capable of moving on projects, but they don't have any kind of accountable framework that they're held to. And so right now we're calling for a change to that, right? There needs to be some reining in of that level of discretion to make sure that public land across all agencies is being used to maximize public benefit whenever it's up for sale or for lease. And it should be addressing the deepest needs in our communities. So that's why we're calling on public land to keep public land in public hands. And in particular, we're calling for a change to our city's charter. So this is a very technical section of our charter, but just to give just a quick framing of what the New York City Charter is, it sets forth the framework of city government, including, as you see, how the city disposes of its city-owned land. But as we saw, there's lots of discretion in that process, but through charter reform, we can change that. And so we're particularly, when we say to keep public land in public hands and to keep public land for public good, we're talking about things like permanent affordability, community-centered uses, anti-displacement, community control. What do we mean by permanent affordability? We mean land that's not just affordable for 30 years, but affordable to many generations of New Yorkers. When we say community-centered uses, we're saying, what are the uses that the community has identified as necessary through broad and democratic processes? Things like community boards plus, right? Like how can community boards shift from not just providing input, but actually leading the way? And so if they're saying that we need 100% deeply affordable housing, then that's what should be happening. When we say anti-displacement, we're saying that the threat of displacement should never, ever have to arise when public land is on the table, not in public land, right? The people who live, work, and contribute to the community have a collective right to that space. And then when we say community control, we're saying that there needs to be democratic structures and processes in place to ensure that community members are making the decisions and leading the way. So really quickly, we just wanted to present the proposal, right? So you all learned, I believe at the last meeting, that there's this Racial Justice Commission that's empowered as a charter revision commission to prepare ballot proposals, right? So they are gonna present certain opportunities, certain ideas for New Yorkers to vote on in 2022. And their mandate is to put forth ballot initiatives that are going to address systemic racism through structural reform of our New York City charter. And we know that public land reform is a structural solution to the racial inequities that we're seeing in land use and housing. Right now, the charter allows very loose and market-driven ways for land to be disposed of and to be leased. And the city's actually squandering valuable opportunities to use some of its most valuable assets, land, to repair the past harms that have been wrought on Black and Brown communities. And they could be instead changing that to advance more equitable development. So we're saying that when city-owned property is going to be sold or leased, the city must prioritize resident-controlled CLTs and other community-based nonprofits that commit to permanent affordability of land and housing and meaningful tenant and community control, right? So if the city has land and is saying, we're gonna put out an RFP, as Tina mentioned, to developers, we're saying before you go to for-profit developers that have profit in mind, first accept and review applications of CLTs and nonprofits that actually are placing people over profit. And if they have a viable application, you need to be disposing of land to these groups, provided that they're committed to permanent affordability and meaningful tenant and community control. So that's what we're calling for in this proposal. And we're calling for the Racial Justice Commission to do that. That was a very quick overview of the proposal, but we're happy to take any questions.
That was an amazing overview of the proposal.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And this was wonderful. I wish we had more time to really sit and discuss. In my head is going back. Can we just have a personal part 2 with you guys? I gotta run.
Yeah, I have to run too.
Because I got someone meeting me downstairs, but this was wonderful. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Alikah. And I'll talk to you guys on the weekend, my colleagues.
And Natalia, if you don't mind sharing this page for folks, that would be great for folks. Because if you want to continue the conversation, I think that would be a helpful part too.
Okay.
Yeah, I also have to leave.
I sent that out actually in all the emails, and we'll highlight it again in the blog post.
Perfect. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This was really amazing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.